What we are looking at now is, I think, going to the root of what we can encounter in the first time of history, economic, social, political, cultural, whatever it is. And we are going back to one of the key moments of what we can call, together with China's official lingo, reform and opening. So we are going back to not only, I think, a key turning point in China's history, but if I understand correctly, then also the opening chapter of your book. So with that, I would like to hand over to John, and we are really excited about your presentation.
Thank you, Gabor. Always a pleasure to be able to support the RAS. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thoughts I'm going to share with you this evening are about 1978, a year of enormous significance. Somebody pointed out in a chat room earlier that sounds suspiciously like the book title 1587, A Year of No Significance. That's not by accident. It is true that 1978, A Year of Enormous Significance, is the first section of my project. And I'll share a bit more about that with you in a minute, but the overall project is called First Time in History, and let's have a look at why. So here's a little about me. I have been here in East Asia for 30 years, 20 here in Shanghai. I mostly have, over those years, have worked with the Antai College, and my project, current project with the Antai College is quite a lot of fun, actually. We used to have delegations coming to China all the time from all over the world, people that wanted to learn about China. Well, that was in the before time. And of course, for the past 2 years, we haven't had so many of those delegations. So we're taking that concept and that content and putting it online. We're doing dialogues with executives and doing site visits and recording all of that and producing that into a program, which we're going to launch in autumn. And we will do that along with a published work in support. So it's pretty fun. It's pretty interesting. That's my current project with the school. My content side for the school, the topic that I do seminars on is First Time in History. And I've been working on that thanks to the school, giving me a great platform for about 10 years now. And it's a work in progress, as Gabor suggested. I started out just being a series of presentations, and then I thought about maybe making it a book, and I have one very gracious book offer from a respected publisher, but I'm waiting to develop more of the content so that it's a better package for the publisher. I've got some of the pieces have been published here and there online, and I do this sort of thing. So First Time in History kind of fits my my preferences, because I have an MBA and I work at a business school, but I'm quite keen on history, and I'm also I have an undergrad in literature. So the combination of those things together leads to macroeconomic history, hopefully well told. And I'm kind of happy to have a chance to work on things that resonate with different aspects of things that I like. I have registered FTIH.org. My website is a work in progress. I haven't launched it. I expect to do so in May. And that will be basically a catch-all for all of the bits and pieces around this project. And when it launches, I'll be sure to let the RAS community know. And you can spend as much time as you like visiting all sorts of archived articles and podcasts and interviews and whatnot about the First Time in History. So for me to claim that First Time in History is a valid concept, I think you deserve, or anybody deserves, a bit of an elevator speech, which is what's happened in China really a first time in history phenomenon? First of all, what does first time in history mean? Basically, it means that since 1978, since the era of reform and opening up, that China has grown with a speed and scope faster than any economy in world history. Full stop. And it's not even close. And I think that's pretty interesting. And so my project is about why has that happened and what does it portend for us? What might we see in the future as a result of this first time in history phenomenon? So first of all, can I prove to you that there is in fact a first time in history phenomenon? That's what happened. That what has happened here is in fact a historical first. I'm going to start by sharing a couple of slides to prove that point, I hope. And then I'm going to talk to you about what I consider to be the tectonic drivers of the first time in history phenomenon. And they are four. And one of them is a very promising demographic baseline in 1978. The second one is the entrepreneurship of Chinese people. And I mean entrepreneurship in the wider sense of the word. I don't just narrowly mean investing in a startup. I mean, well, I'll get to that. Foreign engagement on a historic scale is the third point, which also began in 1978, in October of 1978 to be precise. And some rather wise and forward government-looking policy starting at about that time, a lot of which was basically getting out of the way, deregulating, so that Chinese people working with themselves and with collaboration with foreigners and global markets could develop China into what we see today. So this is my suggestion that you may be skeptical about the idea that there is in fact a first time in history phenomenon. So let me see if I can try to prove it to you. This is a scatter plot of GDP per capita 1950 and 2016. This is measured in PPP, and it's purchasing power parity. And if you can see on the, I think that's the left scale. Where are my glasses here? Left scale, the y-axis is 2016. The x-axis is 1950. So the way this graph works is the farther away you are from that zero line, the more your economy has grown over the course of these 70 years. So you can see that India is there.
The farther above, if we are correct, right?
Huh?
The farther above. I mean, if you're below the line and you're far away. Then...
The farther to the up and left.
Mm.
So the closer you are to the northwest corner, the top left corner, the greater the growth. India, you can see there's a line at about 4, that's the world average. And India at that blue arrow is slightly below that over the course of these 70 years. Here are Brazil and Indonesia. They have grown at about 8 times their 1950 level over the course of these 70 years. And I think you can see where I'm going with this. There's China. China has grown at about a 15 times pace over the course of these 70 years. And if we extended that out to 2000 over time compared to the other 3 large population developing economies, would be even greater. China's at about 21 now. Here's another way to look at it. These lines represent the growth of the various countries. I've used developing economy at the top for a baseline, a developed economy at the top for a baseline. And you can see that Brazil and Indonesia and India are in there. India is the line at the bottom. What you should be able to see is that there's one slope there that's steeper than the others. A steeper slope means faster economic growth, and that steeper slope is China. So I think these two graphics should indicate that on a gross domestic product basis, that China's growth has been exceptional over the course of this time. Now, there's a couple of other things to think about, because I'm not just making a claim about back to 1950, I'm making a claim back to when we were wandering around in the Serengeti as hunter-gatherers, that China's growth is unprecedented in human history in terms of scale and scope. So one thing to keep in mind is there was no rapid per capita GDP growth before the Industrial Revolution. Didn't exist. GDP growth before the Industrial Revolution was basically how much grain an individual farmer could produce, or how much wheat, or how much potatoes. Rapid economic growth only started happening with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution about 230, 240 years ago. China and India were relatively flat from the mid-18th to the mid-20th century. Historically, large population countries did better in GDP aggregate because they had more people. It's natural, more farmers. Great Britain, of course, had a great deal of GDP growth, starting with the Industrial Revolution, one of the leading countries in the Industrial Revolution. But their growth over 200 years was only about 5 times. And Europe was less. Those of you here in the audience who know European history, I'm sure that Gabor knows this, will remember that Europe was somewhat otherwise occupied in the years between, say, 1700 and 2000, mostly with killing each other. And the United States, which of course was a great growth story of the late 19th and early 20th century, grew about 5 times over 100 years. But China grew much more than that in a much shorter period of time, with a population base that is 5 to 10 times the size, to 20 times the size of those other economies. So I hope that I have convinced you to not have this expression, but to have this expression when I claim that what's happened in China is the first time in history phenomenon. So with that as a base, let me turn to 1978. 1978 is a benchmark year, not just for me. A lot of people have recognized this over the course of many years, in large part because that was the year that Deng Xiaoping and the Third Plenum announced reform and opening up. They announced the end of class struggle as the paradigm and economic development as the new paradigm. That all happened in December 1978. Well, around that time, the official communique was in December. And that's why a lot of people mark 1978 as the year that reform and opening started and the year that China's astonishing growth began. You can see here a former Financial Times Chinese edition editor, Mr. Zhang, made a claim like this in 2008. Famed author and journalist Jonathan Fenby has the first chapter of his book, which is called Tiger Head Snake Tails, published 11 years ago. And the chapter is called Never Before, because Jonathan outlines in his chapter succinctly why the phenomenon of China's growth over the course of these 40 years is, in fact, a first time in history phenomenon, and it all began in 1978. These are the 3 elements of 78 special. I've already mentioned about the Third Plenum, quite famous. The other 2 that are sometimes not getting as much attention as they should, that are emblematic of why China's first time in history phenomenon occurred, also happened in the last 90 days of 1978. And the first one was when Deng Xiaoping visited Japan in October of that year. And the second one was also in mid-December, but a bit earlier than the third plenary session. And that was when 18 villagers in a small village in Antai province called Xioagang decided to risk their futures, their lives, on readjusting how they would work together and how they would do their farming, what they would do with their produce. We'll get to that in a minute. So why would, I'm going to start with Deng Xiaoping and going overseas. Going overseas is one of the 4 key components of the first time in history phenomenon. Engaging with foreign markets, engaging with foreign enterprises coming to China and bringing technology transfer, management practices, and equally as importantly, becoming a market for Chinese goods and services. And part of the reason for that was because up until 1978, the economy was a basket case, having just escaped the Cultural Revolution. In the 30 years of the Mao era, there was negative growth. Growth was flat basically for all of the 1950s. There was a 10% decline in GDP growth in the early 1960s as a result of the Great Famine. And then during the early years of the Cultural Revolution, there was 0 growth. So Deng Xiaoping and others knew that if they wanted to revitalize the economy, that engagement with foreign markets and foreign technology and foreign management practice and business practice would be essential to recapture China's potential. And so he went to Tokyo. And famed journalist and scholar Richard McGregor has said this in his book, which is called Asia's Reckoning, which is a tremendous book. The West remembers Deng Xiaoping's trip to the United States in 1979. That's Chairman Deng, Vice Chairman Deng wearing his hat there, famously in Houston, Texas, in the United States. But McGregor goes on to say that it was the historic visit to Japan months earlier that really opened China's eyes to modernization. So why did Deng choose Japan as the first country to visit as part of his desire to re-engage with the world, with foreign business, with foreign economies? Well, it's close. It's a 3-hour, 4-hour plane ride. Probably, maybe a little bit longer back then when jets didn't run so fast. There's, of course, more than 2,000 years of history between China and Japan. Japan is culturally, spiritually, even genetically a child of China. And Deng knew that Japan's recovery since the war had been extraordinary. Japan's growth from 1945 was massive. And Japan had technology and Japan had money. And finally, Deng in part went to Japan in October of 1978 to formalize and sign the Peace and Friendship Treaty. So he had a number of reasons to go to Japan. And here he is. He's walking on the red carpet with then Prime Minister Fukuda. And in the lower left, you see a picture of Deng shaking hands with Matsushita Konosuke, who was the founder and chairman of Matsushita Panasonic National, the company that goes by a number of names. The visit to the business leaders in Japan arguably was more important for China's development than the political visit, because Deng visited Nippon Steel, and he visited a Honda manufacturing plant. And at Matsushita, he visited their television manufacturing and their other appliance manufacturing facilities. He rode the high-speed train. He learned about all of Japan's technological and consumer developments firsthand. And that was, of course, a primary reason why he went. He saw these things. That on the top left, probably those of you who are less than 30 don't even know what that is. We called those video cassette recorders back in the day, and Matsushita was one of the leading producers of them, the other company being Sony. The story of the fight between those two is an interesting tale for another time. He rode the bullet train, as I mentioned, and he went to visit the Honda factory at the Zama facility in the western part of Tokyo. It was Kimitsu Steel he visited. And all of these things he saw, of course, were what he went for, because China had none of these at the time. And he was hopeful that by going, that he would be able to convince the Japanese business people that engaging with China would be a good thing to do. And he basically said, we have a lot of people, we have land, we have resources, and we are reopened for business. We are opening our economy and our regulations to allow foreign joint ventures, to allow foreigners to do business here. We want you to come and help us because you have technology and you have money and we don't. Oh, and by the way, a couple decades ago, you murdered about 10 million of our people more, and so you owe us one. And it worked. And as a result, companies like Matsushita, here's a famous visit of Chinese engineers visiting the, Matsushita engineers visiting the Shanghai Lighting Company back in 1979. And this kind of visit, which resulted in technology transfers and joint ventures, was repeated all over China, especially on the East Coast, through the 80s into the 90s. This quote here is from Ezra Vogel. From 1979 to 1999, Japan provided 56% of all of China's bilateral aid. Deng chose well when he chose a country to visit in 1978, to help China re-energize its economy. There's some really interesting expressions of that. Bao Steel here in Shanghai was built on a framework, on architecture, and on plans, and on technology that was provided by Kimitsu Steel. Most of the Chinese auto business was built on Japanese technology. The consumer markets were built on Japanese technology. The consumer products like TVs and rice cookers were built on Japanese technology. And so was this. One of my powerful memories here in China was back 14 years ago when I rode the first Gautier, one of the early Gautiers in China. It was in 2007, and I rode from Shanghai to Hangzhou. And I remember getting into the train. It was this train, I think, or this model. And I remember thinking it was so much like the bullet train in Japan that the sound of the doors was the same. The smell was the same. It was a remarkable experience. I lived in Japan for many years before I came to China, so I was well aware of the bullet train. The technology transfer from Japan to China was profound. It was eventually matched by technology transfers from other countries. China's re-engagement with the world and ultimately selling to foreign markets was an essential pillar of China's first time in history rise. Now, here's another story. One bit about China's first time in history rise is the engagement with foreign markets, both for selling products there and for bringing technology in and management practices in. Another bit is entrepreneurship with Chinese characteristics. I love this story, and some of you may know it. I'm sure that some of you do. It deserves to get more attention than it does. This happened in mid-December 1978. At the time, there were about 18 households in this village. The arrow points to it there. It's just northeast of Hefei. And half of the 120 villagers in this village in the starving years died of starvation. And 1978 was a bad harvest year. The villagers in 1978 felt that they were in danger of large-scale starvation again if they didn't do something to change the way they were working, the way they were producing grain, the way they were organized as an economic entity. At that time, of course, everything was collective. 100% of whatever output they produced went to the collective. Well, they famously got together and thumbprinted and in some cases chopped a document that said, we are going to reorganize the way that we work. We are going to deliver our quota to the Danwei, to the work group. But whatever we produce in excess of that, we're going to keep for ourselves and use as we see fit. This document states that. It also states at the end there at the bottom that if any of them are captured or killed as a result of their taking this step, that the others agree to care for the children until the children reach the age of 18. And they had to do this because making this declaration in 1978 was a felony, maybe even a capital offense, because it broke the rules of strict collectivization. But they did so anyway. And they did so because they feared large-scale starvation if they didn't reorganize the way they worked. So what I like to say is that this is an extreme and noble example of entrepreneurship. We commonly think of entrepreneurs as people who risk some time and some money. Well, these guys risk their lives, their freedom, in order to reorganize how they work and do so in an entrepreneurial way. Now, as a result of this, their harvest for 1978 went up by a factor of 5. They harvested 5 times as much grain in 1979, as they did in 1978. No good deed goes unpunished. Village officials heard about what they'd done. They were threatened with jail and death. Fortunately, there was a party chair for, I think, Anhui province, who was a rather enlightened individual who recognized that there was something going on here that should not be punished, but learned from. And the Xioagang experiment, along with others that had happened, notably in Sichuan, became the basis for the foundation of what's called the household responsibility system, and the Chinese for that is there, and the town and village enterprise system. And that happened because 1978 wasn't 1968. If these guys and they were the heads of household, had done this in 1968, they almost surely would have been imprisoned and many of them killed. As a consequence, they did this by candlelight. This event happened at candlelight. There's no electricity in this village. They didn't have the chance to turn on a light bulb because they were committing a crime. But now they are recognized widely in China as having been pioneers of the reform and opening up era. This bas-relief here is part of is part of this museum that you see in this picture here. This is in the village of Xioagang, as is this document. This document is now under glass, and tourists go and visit it because these 18 men are, to my mind, rightfully recognized as having taken an entrepreneurial step that changed their lives and changed China. Not alone, but they are major contributors, and that's why they're recognized, and deservedly so. The fourth piece, we've had a promising demographic, engagement with foreign markets, entrepreneurship of the Chinese people, which may be the most important of the three. And the fourth one was some favorable direction of government policy. And that started with the third plenary session in December of 1978. Again, 1978 is a big year. Autumn 1978 is a big season. And that happened in this hotel. It's the Jingxi Hotel in Northwest Beijing. And Deng Xiaoping's famous statement in the communique was that from this day forward, we renounce class struggle as the central focus and instead take up economic development as our central focus. At this time, the four modernizations were launched as policy. The modernizations themselves were not new. They had been discussed for 20 years by that time. But at this point, they were codified as policy. And this session also, along with the entrepreneurial farmers, became the basis for the household responsibility system and the town and village enterprises. Here's a picture of the delegates to the third session voting for the communique, which was passed on the 22nd of December. And as you can see, they all have their hands up. I imagine that was a good thing at the time. Anybody who didn't raise their hand would probably have faced some negative consequences. Here is a great talk by Hong Kong University Science and Technology faculty, Professor Park. Professor Park's talk is about what happened as a result of 1978, and specifically the development of the town and village enterprise system. And his chart here indicate, this video is available online. If you click this link, you can find it. I've put this PDF available for all of you. There's a lot of links in here to the various bits of content if you want to investigate this further. There's some great videos about the Xioagang Villagers. There's some great videos about a lot of things. I won't share them with you this evening out of both time and bandwidth. But Professor Park's talk is available online. And what he shows in this graph is that something around 20% of business was private in the 1980s, in the early 1980s. And by 1996, just 16 years later, that number had almost reversed. 70% of business was in private hands by the latter half of the 1990s. 16 years, a pretty dramatic change for anybody's economy. So that is my 30,000 foot run through of the year 1978 and autumn in particular. I hope that I've demonstrated to you that there were four tectonically important drivers for the first time in history phenomenon. The demographics that China had in 1978, promising compared to other large developing economies. Foreign engagement on a historic scale. Some very wise and forward-looking government policy that started at about that time. And finally, people like this. This is a picture of the Xioagang Villagers in the late 1970s. And this picture comes from Six Tone, Six Tone is a great media enterprise based here in Shanghai. And if you don't know about Six Tone, I encourage you to follow them. They did a report on the Xioagang Villagers 3.5 years ago. There was a lot of reporting on the 1978 phenomenon in 2018, 40 years later, including some reportage about the Xioagang Villagers. And this is a picture that they published courtesy of one of the villagers from all the way back in those times long ago. And so to close out this evening, I'll ask us to raise a virtual glass to these gentlemen and hundreds of millions of other Chinese entrepreneurs who helped take China from the living standards you see in this picture to what we all see us around us today. And with that, I'll open for questions. Thank you.
Here, here. I'll take over for a couple of minutes.
Please do.
To switch over to the discussion mode. We have 28 people on the call, including the two of us, which means we are really looking forward to questions both in the chat module, which I'm trying to monitor and make sure that we are attending to all the questions.
I've got it too.
Oh, perfect. Okay. And also, I mean, if somebody really feels that your question is better asked through the microphone, that is a possibility too. However, I would like to ask a couple of things, both in order to get as much out of our time with John as we can, but also in order to prevent some disappointments about having your questions answered. So there are two general house rules I would like to ask you. First of all, make the questions a question rather than a comment. And the other, I mean, even if you would have a comment, I think it's better to just formulate into an open question and see what John and others have to say about that. And the other thing is that please use your grammatical skills and try to make it as short as you can make it, because both of us have quite a bit of experience with online speaking. It is extremely difficult to read long questions while you are answering another question. And also, it is extremely uncomfortable to watch a speaker read a question without speaking. So that's not the best use of our time. So if you can make it into let's say 10 words or less, that would be absolutely amazing. If you have to make it a little bit longer, do. But for example, the first thing that came in, if I were the speaker, I would struggle a little bit to read it.
Yeah, but I have to say that Lydia Khan's question is really great, and I look forward to speaking to it. So whenever I get to that point, I will.
I would like to start with one thing that I would like to ask you. I jotted down a couple of things, and immediately after that, we are going to Lydia's question. In the meantime, feel free to type as well. So you repeatedly emphasize something that I find extremely interesting. You said at the very beginning that the job of the leadership was getting out of the way. And then you shared quite a bit of data to support that. Zero growth or negative growth in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, steep slope of development afterwards. Also, right. I mean, I would like to add that there is this, I mean, ad nauseum quoted figure that since the beginning of the reform and opening, the Chinese leadership took 750 million people out of poverty, which also means that about 30 years into the party's rule, 3/4 of the population was in poverty. You showed us very well.
I want to let me jump in there for a minute.
Yes.
I'm not a fan of that construction. There are 4 reasons why China's growth has been so astonishing, and why more people have escaped poverty in China in the past 40 years than any time in human history by far.
Right.
And I think the number 1 reason should be to people like the Xioagang Villagers. Chinese
I absolutely
people,
agree. I absolutely agree.
Yeah, government policy could be part of it, but it's not. This was not even a majority top-down led initiative. Government policy helped, and some of that policy was just getting out of the way.
Well, actually, first of all, you can imagine Deng's shock when he saw all that technology in Japan and saw where his own country is. And then the other thing is that the Xioagang village, there is another great example which has been studied, researched, and published recently is Shenzhen's rise. And the more I read about it, the more I can see that actually that was a bottom-up organic developmental movement that had a party stamp on it afterwards. My question yeah.
Both are important. The Shenzhen, one of the probably the most famous special economic zone. It was able to grow because it was given a looser rein. But obviously, entrepreneurship has driven most of what Shenzhen is today.
That's right. Now, the lesson is to get out of the way. It has worked. Do you see that idea consistently working over the last couple of decades in Chinese history, or can you see some kind of fluctuation between getting out of the way, letting
lots
people...
of fluctuation.
Sorry?
Tons of fluctuation. And I don't want to dismiss the government's leadership role by saying it's all about getting out of the way. That would be unfair. There was a lot of pretty wise stuff that that various iterations of the government did between 1978 and even now. But part of that was just getting out of the way. And the town and village enterprises and the household responsibility system in particular, particularly the town and village enterprise system. Yasen Huan from MIT has an entire book on the TVEs, largely on the TVEs.
Right.
And he talks about just how astonishingly powerful those were in the 80s and the 90s.
You said Lydia's question was a great one, so why don't we go on to that? I got a very good answer to mine.
I'm going to read this because, and thank you, Lydia, this is really interesting. She says the Chinese economy was not a basket case from 1900 to 1935. Correct. Entrepreneurs like my great-grandfather, Zhen Xiaonan, and his company, Nanyang Tobacco, sent 45 young men and wives to study in the US and bring back technology from 1920 to 1924. And she closes by saying the family mansion is in the laboratory building of Shanghai Jiao Hospital. And she also mentions about her grandfather. You can read the question in the chat box. I couldn't possibly agree more that despite a very difficult time, the Shanghai Revolution, the warlord era, the Northern Expedition, lots of warfare in China during those years, there was substantial growth and development. And some of it was coming from the kinds of sources that Lydia mentions. There were many expeditions overseas to try to learn from various countries around the world. Easily, the most profound of those of that initiative was toward Japan. There were tens of thousands of Chinese, mostly students, in Japan in 1915, 1920, early 1910s. The number started to tail off as hostilities between the two countries ratcheted up. But Japan was, in the early part of the 20th century, was far and away the strongest contributor to Chinese development, but many other countries as well. And the Chinese development that came from Japan didn't come from Japan organically, it came through Japan. Chinese young people went to Japan to learn about the West because it was easier to do so through Japanese, which is, you know, a language that uses Chinese characters, than it was to learn to read German and English and French and all that. But enormous development and promise in the early part of the 20th century. There's lots of great work about that. Decotter has a good book about that. And thank you, Lydia, for raising that point.
Also, I think Chinese people who went to the US or Europe to learn had a harder time than Chinese people who went to Japan. There was more suspicion. There was a wider cultural gap than in Japan.
Sorry, say that again, Gabor. Lydia just put up an interesting comment.
I think that Chinese people who went to Japan to learn, they had a much easier time to get into good universities, to Japan shared knowledge and know-how much more generously with Chinese people than the West at that time.
It was for a variety of reasons, proximity is not small. You could get to Japan in a couple of days by boat back then. Going to Europe was, a week's journey, a week's long journey.
Right.
Some of those boats didn't make it. There was a famous contingent of Chinese laborers going to help out in World War I. They got torpedoed, and some 500 of them went to the bottom of the sea.
Right.
So the proximity was big. The ease of living for Chinese people in Japan, because they could already read, was big. There's an enormous cultural affinity between the two places, because Japan is literally a child of China. So
Right.
much easier from there.
How about this question? Can you talk more about the demographic back in 1978?
Sure.
Why was it so special?
So what was special about it is that the incipient globalization and the potential to engage with foreign markets and the potential to get their own people involved in globalization and development on an enormous scale. This is the presentation that I do for the college.
Mm-hmm.
This is Fenby's book. This is a really good book, and it's the first chapter, Never Before, that talks about the first time in history phenomenon, and he calls it Never Before. So here's the graph I just showed you about GDP growth, the GDP per capita, the dramatic reduction in poverty over the course of a few decades.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is the demographic story. Thank you for asking that question. So this is what's called a population pyramid, and this is a website called populationpyramid.net that draws its data from the United Nations as well as some other reputable sources. The pyramid you see on the left is the pyramid of the world, the average of the world's population. The one you see on the right is from the United States. And the difference you see there, and the big bulge you see in the middle, is the baby boom, people like me, the famous baby boom in the post-war. What you see in the difference there is that the United States pyramid is narrow at the bottom and fatter at the top. And what that reflects is life expectancy. The United States life expectancy in 1990, is the case of this data, is obviously greater than the world. Here are the population pyramids of the large developing economies, which are Brazil, Indonesia, and India, which I use as a benchmark when I'm talking about China, because those are the best benchmark, because they're hundreds of millions of people, and their economies were in roughly the same shape as China's was in 1970s. China's literacy rate was below all of them except India. And healthcare was difficult in all of these places, much more difficult. And that's why you see a pyramids for these three countries that are fatter at the bottom, because people didn't live as long. Their life expectancy was lower. So that's the pyramids for the three large developing economies. This is China's pyramid. You will see that it is narrower at the bottom, and that it's a little bit fatter at the top compared to the developing economies. And you will also see that it's got an enormous bulge. That's China's baby boom. China's baby boom happened just after the Great Starvation, after the Great Famine. So it starts in the mid-60s and it carries through the early 70s. There's some interesting demographics at play when you consider the effect of the one-child policy. And that is because China's total fertility rate dropped by 50% before the one-child policy kicked in. There were actually a few more births in 1985 than there were in 1980. Demographers around the world, many of them think that the one-child policy was actually unnecessary demographically. Right. That's another topic. What is interesting is that China had this big baby boom in the 60s and into the early into about 1970. So what this means is that China has, because of life expectancy, you can see that on this graph, there's a very steep slope from you can see that in the starving time, life expectancy actually declines, which is reasonable because 30 million people died. You can then see that the slope really kicks up after that as China's healthcare initiatives, notably the Barefoot Doctors, it was called the Rural Community Medical Program, that Barefoot Doctors became a part of, kicked in and really started to raise healthcare and reduced infant mortality and increased life expectancy. And it had a major effect, driving China's life expectancy well above the other large developing economies. So what that means is that the pyramid, this is 1990, 80s data looks pretty much the same, except that bulge is lower because the people are 10 years younger. So the pyramid is narrower at the bottom, fatter at the top, which means that people are living longer. And there's a demographic bubble, which is young people just coming online to work in the 1990s, right when China is starting to engage with the world for becoming the manufacturing center for the planet. And they were literate, because China's one of the things that the Mao years that the government did during those 30 years from 1949 through the 1970s was improve China's healthcare and you can see that in life expectancy, but also improve China's literacy and education, especially for women. So Chinese literacy by 1990 was rivaling the other large developed economies. And in 1950, it was 20%. So you can see that China's slope is much steeper here. And it had passed the other developing economies by 1990. You can see that it's way ahead of India. People used to ask in the 1990s, is China the country of the future, or is India the China of the future? If they'd only looked at this, they would have seen. And Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen makes a powerful argument about the importance of education and life expectancy in driving global economies. And he points at China's accomplishments by 1980, by the time of the era of reform and opening up, as being maybe the most important driver in what made the difference between China and India in the subsequent decades. So back to the pyramid. By this time, when China is starting to engage with the world for bringing in technology, raising the caliber of the workforce, being able to produce at global standards for global markets, China had strong literacy, better healthcare, and hundreds of millions of 100 million, 200 million young people of the right age to start to go to work in factories. All of those things were very promising for China and led to what we saw here in the 90s. There's a book that's really great about the migrant worker phenomenon in the 1990s and early 2000s. Let me get it for you here. This is Leslie Chang's Factory Girls.
Oh, yeah.
It's written in 2006. Well, she wrote it. She wrote bits and pieces of it as she was a Dow Jones journalist covering South China throughout the early part of the last decade. And then she basically took her work and compiled it into a tremendous book. And one of the reasons that this book is interesting is it looks at women who were a large part of the migrant workforce in the 1990s. And they were able to work in factories because they could read, because they had education. The female working population of China was an enormous driver of China's GDP success from the 90s on. And that's the demographic, one of the pieces of the demographic advantage that China had going into these decades. That's a long answer to a short question.
No, it's amazing. No, I mean, I think all of this helps. You know, what I have been wondering about until next questions are coming up is that how much of a shock could this have been to a Chinese population who has been listening to stories about the capitalist world, including Japan, basically attacking and hurting China for decades, especially when Japanese engineers, I mean, I did some work with Baosteel. They are well aware of their Japanese heritage. And when these people started coming in after a couple of decades when China didn't really have foreigners, and how it appeared in local media, what was the narrative that the government told Chinese people?
Gabor, that's a good question. I don't have an answer to what sort of official communique was coming from municipal and regional and national government leaders for Chinese people at that time. in any succinct way. I do know what we do know that the message from the national government level on down was that it's time to put class warfare away. It's time to focus on economic development. Foreign engagement is a key component of our ability to modernize. And that is exactly why Deng Xiaoping went to Japan. And he said so. And the way he said so is a story, I've actually talked about it in the previous RAS talk. He invoked a legend that is common to both China and Japan. It's in Chinese, it's shufu, and in Japanese, it's jofuku. That's another talk for another time.
We did have it.
Yeah, we did this some time ago.
Yeah.
Another topic that's near and dear to my heart. But the government was obviously behind economic development. The cities, the municipalities, the provinces, the regions were gaining an enormous amount of money, development from the investment that was coming. There's a very interesting story about what was happening with FDI from the 80s on. It turns out that most of it was actually coming from China itself. It would go out to Hong Kong or to the BVI and then come back in. They called it round trip money.
Right.
And the money did that in order to gain the tax advantage. But the investment in development was not just money, it was technology transfer. It was the engineers from Matsushita going to Shanghai Lighting and spending their time helping the manufacture, the people there manufacture at a global scale. So I'm quite confident that, of course, the hostility was there historically, especially to Japan, of course, but it was a pragmatic time. And the idea was, yeah, we have some historical problems. We'll acknowledge that, but let's get on with business.
Now, those people were closer in time to the end of the Second World War than we are now to the time that you are talking about. So I also wonder, I mean, Deng Xiaoping himself was not educated in Japan. He spent some time in France, but I can imagine that at that time, the guard in China that was trained in Japan and God forbid even spoke the language still had positions in the Chinese government. Are you aware of people who, was it a little bit like a reunion, or did the Chinese government replace those people?
I don't think there were, I don't know for sure, but I think there were very few people who had strong engagement with Japan that would have had any possibility of a role in the Chinese government post 1949, because those people would have been seen as collaborators.
Right.
So I'm sure there were some. And of course, in more recent times, I think it's Wang Yi who was fluent in Japanese. But one of the leading, one of the two guys that went to Anchorage back in March of 2021, a year ago, and had that spirited exchange with the U.S. Secretary of State Blinken. One of those two guys is fluent in Japanese, having spent time there and studied. And of course, there's lots of people now who are. I think Lydia mentioned that she is actually 1/8 Japanese because her grandfather established some operations in Kobe. Congratulations. Yeah, so the interaction was, of course, centuries long and really profound in the late 19th and earlier 20th century. I don't think there was much of it from 1940s through the late 1970s, but boy, did it kick off in the 80s.
It did.
Matsushita invited 250 Chinese engineers to come to Japan and study for 6 months, a year, learn from Japanese manufacturing, how to manufacture at global levels of quality, and times that by 1 million. There were so many interactions at the business level with Japan and to a lesser extent with other countries.
Do you see a continuity between this time and, let's say, great 21st century success stories like Alibaba and the involvement of SoftBank?
No, I don't get the sense that SoftBank was the technology leader. Alibaba was pretty confident of their technology. So it wasn't so much that that Jack Ma and co were going to SoftBank for, cap in hand begging for a technology transfer. Mostly what they got is money.
No, it is money. I
Uh,
mean, SoftBank is in money. I'm just wondering if, it's at that time, lots of Western firms, especially if we look at investment and consulting companies, they told me at that time they were still unsure about China, where it's heading. So do you think this kind of experience basically Japanese decision makers rested assured a little bit more because they knew the story from the beginning, they had inside information, they knew much more about the dynamics of China than, let's say, Western decision makers?
I think that's easily possible. Of course, it's much easier for a Japanese person to learn Chinese than for anybody from
Right.
a non-kanji culture, a non-Hanzi culture. And by the way, Connor posts, thank you, that it is Wang Yi who's a Japanese speaker.
Right.
Um, there's another factor one of the great expressions of this, this is a great story. I forget which journalist I've got this in my notes somewhere, but in 1966, at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, this is in spring, the first Dazibao are starting to appear at Beida. And there were, of course, some Western journalists in Beijing, but there were Japanese journalists there too. They could read the big character posters because they read characters. The Westerners could not.
Right.
It was Japanese journalists on the ground in 1966 that alerted some of the foreigners that something big is happening here. That's a telling story, and I'm sure that's been true along the way with Japanese engagement in China. I worked for a Japanese media group here 15 years ago, and our business was launching Japanese-based reporting on China in English, because we felt that our Japanese journalists on the ground had a better grasp of what was happening on the ground because they could just read more.
May I ask you another question? Like you mentioned a couple of times about delegations and helping Westerners understand China better. And you said that one of the inspirations of this entire first time in history concept was delegations visiting China. And I was wondering, out of all the things that you told us, and probably this is just the tip of the iceberg and lots of others we didn't have time for today, what were the facts for visiting delegations which they were generally aware of, and okay, you had to call attention on their significance and refresh their memory a little bit, but it was more or less understood? And what were the facts from this era that perhaps you shocked these visiting delegations because they are just not common knowledge, perhaps that part of history that we don't talk about enough in order to understand the present? I imagine their faces, and sometimes when you are talking about this, they are nodding because they already know most of it, although now they are reconfirming how important it is. But what would be the jaw-dropping moments that most people just simply didn't know about, and they should, to understand China's current dynamics?
I'll tell you one. There's 2 points from the talk that I've given to foreign delegations here that always I can feel the room go, oh, wow. And one of them is to show a comparison of unnatural death in Europe and in the Americas going back a few centuries. Germany, of course, suffered horribly during the 30 Years' War, and the entire continent suffered during the plague era. But I put up a slide that shows the history of unnatural death in China that starts with the Anlushan Rebellion in the Tang Dynasty that killed about 50% of the population, and ongoing civil wars, the Taiping Rebellion, which is the largest civil strife in human history, and they don't understand the degree to which the enormous amount of suffering that is historical China, and therefore the degree to which Chinese people famously fear luan, unrest, disorder, chaos. And I show that is actually continued, of course, through the early part of the 20th century and into the 1960s. That's one that really catches their attention. Another one is a lot of them haven't realized that for I ask a question at the part of this part of the talk. I say, try to guess how many years China wasn't number one or number two in global GDP during the past thousands of years. And of course, the answer is only about 150, which is from the early mid 18th century until the late 1990s, early mid 19th century until the 1990s. People often from foreign delegations don't realize that China and India were the global GDP leaders for the entirety of history before that because of their size. Now, I recognize there's trying to think of China as one entity for 2,000 years is just a mistake. But if you use the landmass that we now call China and extrapolate that backwards, that entity was either number one or number two in GDP for 2,000 plus years, except for the period when the Industrial Revolution started and when the Qing dynasty started to fall apart. And so I try to tell people overseas that people here we often, at least in the United States, we're not very famous for our historical nuanced understanding, or geography for that matter. We often think of modern China as being sort of this brash, nouveau riche, startup, arriviste place. Whereas people here know that basically what's happening is that China is just returning to its normal position in the world of being a global leader in GDP. And the foreigners that come and visit often don't understand that. Yeah, and that's why, China is now maybe even number one on a purchasing power parity basis in aggregate GDP, but on per capita is still far behind. It will probably, it may never catch up with the developed economies, but it wouldn't happen for some decades to come.
Yeah, when we are talking about these issues, I always wonder how it shapes the perception of Chinese people on the future role that China plays.
Gabor, if Lydia is still on, I just want to say thank you for her great points. If she's not, if anybody else speaks to her, please thank her in my stead. Please go ahead.
I would like to join you. Yes. She inspired a lot of this conversation today, and also shared her personal story, which is absolutely amazing, including the connection between Japan and China. Yeah, we live in an age, and by this I mean the last couple of years, when the information that we receive on both sides of the border of China is diverging more and more. So we get different narratives about the topics that we are discussing here. If you go to the United States, if you go to Europe, if you go to China, if you go to Japan, if you just mention the most relevant parties. So I'm always wondering how what you told us today would shape the perception of let's say the West and China respectively, and even Japan, if we started to receive the same information. What you shared about this, the GDP between the 50s and 70s and the rapid growth of GDP, or for example, in my Jiao Tong lectures, I showed this 1,000-year graph quite a few times, and then most of the Western observers to that, the next question that they automatically asked is, so do Chinese people see the top economy in the world as their rightful place in the long run? Is it like
yes.
More like
yes,
just recovering that position?
Yes,
as far as they can see it.
Absolutely, regaining a
so?
rightful place in the world. Absolutely.
Okay.
And it's true. An economy, the single largest country on the planet, until soon, India will overtake. Still, arguably, at least from my perspective, the growth story of the 21st century deserves to be recognized as one of the world's leading economies. It is, and historically, the period from the mid 19th century to the late 20th century was a historical aberration.
Right.
You go, and it's not just, you know, GDP. I mean, look at the Tang Dynasty, the Qing in the 1750s. These were the world's leading centers of civilization. 2,000 years ago, the Han Dynasty at the time of the Roman Empire. People here understand their history well enough to know that it is an aberration what happened in those 150 years, and China is just returning to its natural place in the universe. Absolutely.
I'm fascinated to find out how it will happen. Connor has raised his hand. I would like to give the floor to you.
Yeah, so of course, thanks both to John and to Gabor as well for giving the talk, leading the discussion. One thing I wanted to ask a bit about, kind of going back to 1978 again. John, do you know much about like the kind of the general attitude that the Japanese had toward the Chinese at that time? Or do people even really care that much about China, do you think? Or like what was the general feeling in Japan, or at least maybe amongst the government about like, okay, China's coming over, China's opening up. Do we care? What do we think? You know?
So the era of the 80s was an era when, if you, according to poll data, for example, you would see a very highly favorable feeling towards China among the Japanese populace. The story of Japanese people trying to deny the Nanjing Massacre or deny Unit 731 or all of that is oversold here. The people that carry that view are loud in Japan, but it's safe to say that they're not a majority. So I think, you know, come 1980, when Deng, 1978, when Deng goes there, Prime Minister Tanaka came to China in 73, 72, I think, not long after Nixon came. And so the exchange between the two sides didn't start with Deng in 1978. I think it's safe to say that in the late 70s, as this era was beginning, a fair amount of Japanese people recognized that they'd done something pretty bad on a global historical scale in China from the 30s into the 40s until 45. And I think they were happy to have a chance to help out, to contribute to China returning to the world. And I know that's true of Japanese enterprises. And I know it's true that the Chinese leadership and Chinese companies knew that was true and played that card. and they should have, you know, perfectly legitimate. So in those days, in those early years, there was certainly a broad awareness of not universal, of course. There are many people that still think, you know, that the Japanese call it the Daito Asenso, the Greater East Asian War, was a war of liberation, and that Nanjing Massacre didn't happen. There's still some people who think that nonsense, but mostly they don't. And those actually, that sentiment has risen in recent years. Part of the growing animosity between the two places, which is incredibly unfortunate. So at the time, especially, there was a high favorability towards China from Japan, and a recognition that Japan really owed China some help because of what they'd done. Does that answer the question?
There was also, just to add to that, if you don't mind, John, in Ezra Vogel's book on Japan and China, the last one that he wrote, there is a very interesting chapter. He writes that in Japanese popular opinion about China, yeah, that's right, there was always a little bit of delay. So like say the perception in Japan that China was the pinnacle of technological and cultural evolution gradually developed and then ossified. And when the Qing Empire collapsed, and then Japanese started coming back and do business with China at the beginning of 20th century, they were absolutely shocked how behind China is in all these respects.
Yes.
And then again, the opinion ossified like that. And when the reform and opening started, the Japanese people still thought for a long time that China was stuck that way. And then again, in the early 21st century, there was another shock that's not the case again. I like that. Narrative very much because it tells us how wide the information gap can be between countries, even if they are practically neighboring each other.
Japan, up until the late 1860s, well, it was gradual, but starting in the early 1860s, there were more higher level exchanges between Japan and China because Japan was starting to loosen the closed country policy. There had been a fair amount of exchange previous, but it was quite limited through the port of Nagasaki, and it often came through Okinawa. That's a complicated story, but yeah, there was limited understanding in Japan about China, real conditions in China, until about the 1860s, when delegations from Japan started to go. There was a steady increase in Japanese population in Shanghai, for example, toward the later part of the 19th century. And you're right, and Vogel points this out. The Japanese had historically thought of China as the center of the universe, Tianxia. The cities of Nara and Kyoto are built in homage to the city of Xi'an, then Changsha. Chang'an, sorry, not Changsha, Chang'an, thank you. But yeah, the Japanese came here in the late 19th century and were astonished to see just how backward and suffering the actual day-to-day life in China was. And as Vogel points out, they did continue to misread China in some ways, famously in 1937. The Japanese in summer of 1937, after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, invaded Shanghai. The Battle of Shanghai was horrific, and the Japanese were shocked. They had believed that they had been drinking their own Kool-Aid. They believed that they'd be able to walk into Shanghai and there'd be some token resistance and there'd be no problem. They lost 70,000 troops in Shanghai between summer and December of 37. And they were astonished that the Chinese could put up a fight. And a large part of the reason why they committed 6 weeks of horrific atrocities in Nanjing, starting in December of 37, was because they were so incensed that they hadn't been just allowed to come in and take over Shanghai with minimal loss of life. Lots of misapprehension. I think the misapprehension is much less now. There's, until 2012, the Japanese population in Shanghai was the largest foreign population here by far. After the riots of 2012, the Japanese population started to decline. But there's still plenty here. There's still more here than there are people from the US, for example. Korea is now number one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Let's use the last few minutes of this event. Connor, would you like to comment?
No, I was just kind of thinking some more. Again, I was just going to ask a different question, but I was just thinking kind of back to the general, central kind of argument, of John's talk about kind of this level of economic growth being really a first time in history. This is the first time this happened so fast on such a scale in China. And John was kind of pointing to a couple different things like demographics and the other focuses like this, and kind of the government and so forth. I know sometimes people try and talk about culture as a means of, or like a reason for why China is like this. And actually, I think not too long ago, we actually had a professor at our the business school where I'm at, Siebes, gave a talk that kind of
that's the other business school in town, right?
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't really buy that too much. I think it's kind of like the whole argument that culture could really have any meaningful effect on economic growth or things like this. But I still wanted to kind of at least bring that up and kind of throw that out there and see if John, you or anyone else had any thoughts about that.
I instinctively tend to be skeptical about cultural essentialism arguments. I need to see the data, and it's it's a complicated story. There may be something to that. It's certainly true that societies that have a greater regard for education tend to produce cultures and economies that have more growth potential. And China historically has a great reverence for education. So do some other societies. What I do know, aside from the culture argument, is that the demographics alone power the argument that of why the first time in history phenomenon is happening here. I don't need culture to explain what's happened here, unless you are going to say that Chinese entrepreneurship is itself a function of culture. Okay, maybe, all right, but
I have just typed a good data source into the chat box called World Values Survey. I think that's the most helpful source, because then you are going to see that the culture is not constant either. Especially on YouTube, there is a great video of, I think, about 15 years of data from the World Values Survey, and how some countries, including China, shift on the cultural map over the years. Right. That is one reason why we have to be careful with this, because then we will have to create a permutation of economic and cultural data, which would be quite confusing ultimately. John, where
totally agree.
Yeah, please.
The whole argument is very slippery.
It is.
and too clever by half. I'm skeptical.
Where can everybody follow you? I mean, we are saying that a book is forthcoming. Obviously, under normal circumstances, I would say let's all of us have a nice cup of coffee at Garden Books. But if we would like to follow the development of first time in history in different forms, I would like to throw in, and you can say a little bit more about this. The Seneca family has published some of your ideas, and then you can even hear John narrate some of his own articles, which I absolutely love doing. I mean, you last time I told you have a great radio voice, and you said you have a great radio face as well.
Could you please
share a little bit about this? If people want to go a little bit deeper and they eventually want to make sure to know when the book comes out, where can they follow you?
Well, thank you, Gabor, again, and thank you to the RAS for allowing me to share some thoughts with the community. I've been working on the website for a couple of months now, FTIH.org. I guess it's the 21st of April now. I guess I'll have it up in about 3 weeks. And at that time, you'll be able to see, the various articles and bits and pieces of this and that, and more coming. It's going to be basically a catch-all. So I recently wrote an essay for Sixth Tone here. I'm going to give Sixth Tone another plug. They deserve it. They do great work. About one of the ways in which the first time in history phenomenon is driving economic developments in China today in some really interesting ways. And in particular, in looking at what I call Chinese soft brands. So not cars, not appliances, not steel, but fashion and cosmetics and video games, and how those Chinese brands in those spaces are not just being successful in China, but capturing major attention and share on the world stage, in part because of their coming from here, and they have the first time in history phenomenon behind them. So I'll be putting that sort of thing on the website, and I'll love to have as many people visit the website as care to do so. Thank you so much for delivering this to us. I think it has been a great talk, very, very thought-provoking. I have my own notes here, which I will follow up with some internet research on these topics. Thank you very much, everybody. If you are in China, enjoy your evening. If you are somewhere else, then enjoy whichever part of the day is surrounding you. And I hope to be back here again online very soon. One more big cheers to John. Thank you, Gabor. Thank you very much. Thank you to the RAS.